Okay, so in this picture here, which is from page 103 in your textbook, we see five circles, right? We perceive five circles in the picture and shown as labeled as A here. On the bottom picture, picture B, we still perceive five circles there. We are still perceiving five circles, even though there's actually nine chunks inside of that picture, nine distinct continuous units. So there's like one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight, nine pieces here, but we're still perceiving these as circles, right? So I have this continuity, right? Proximity is another Gestalt principle. That's where things that are near to each other are grouped together, right? So things we tend to automatically assume that if things are close to each other, they belong together, right? Common fate, we assume that if things are moving together, that are moving in the same direction, even if they're not together, right? If they're just moving all in the same direction, we tend to group them together. Common region, if elements of something that we're looking at are close together or bound inside of a particular grouping of some kind, we tend to put them together. And then finally, connectedness. If things, if there's some visual thing that is connecting two objects, we assume that the two objects and the visual thing are all interconnected. So, for example, if you see in a very large city, if you see two skyscrapers that are connected by a sky bridge of some kind, we don't perceive that as two separate buildings and a bridge, right? We perceive those buildings and that bridge as being part of the same structure, right? We might even say, we might even go so far as say, well, they're probably owned by the same company or built by the same company because we're grouping them together because they're connected somehow. This picture here is a good example of um, uh, of the way we group things, right? So it's interesting because the woman's top matches the colors of the ocean, and her skirt match the colors of the sand, right? The beach, and We are grouping her skirt with the beach and her top with the ocean because of the similarity in color, right? It makes for a beautiful image, actually. We're grouping these candles. When you look at something like this, right, you're probably not perceiving one, two, five candles or six candles, I should say. You're looking at two groups of candles and one candle by itself, right? One of the groups has two candles in it, the other group has three candles in it. We do that because of proximity, because they're connected to each other, right? Connectedness, right? This is a really good example of continuity, right? So we have the headphones labeled A, and it's very easy for us to follow the cable and match headphone A to plug B. And similarly, we're able to understand that the loop, the cable part of the loop that's labeled C here, is part of cable D, right? It's very easy for us to perceive this because we understand the principle of continuity. We know that, and we know how cables behave, right? We know that they don't all of a sudden break off into like a 45-degree angle, right? We know that at the places where the cables are overlapping, we can tell which the directions that the cables are flowing because we know how cables behave and we know what they look like. We already talked about that. The top picture here, labeled A, is a good example of grouping by region, right? So we do not perceive six separate dots here. Instead, in A, because of the way the regions are drawn around the dots, we perceive three groups of two dots apiece, right? And similarly, the dots in Figure B are connected, or uniform connectedness. So again, we're not perceiving six dots here. Instead, we're perceiving three groups of two dots each. And the reason we perceive each of those groups of two dots is only because they're connected to each other, right? Physically connected to each other. These guys here, their legs are continuous, right? Just because we have the wooden slats uh, blocking our view of the area right beneath their knees, we still perceive their legs as continuing, uh, as continuous wholes, because again we understand the relationships between the rest of the human and the legs, and we're able to perceive continuity even when parts of what we're perceiving are blocked. Okay. Another phenomenon that the Gestalt folks, the Gestaltists studied, was figure ground segregation, right? Our ability to pick out something that is of perceptual importance from the background so that it stands out from the background. Okay? So, for example, if I'm asking you to focus on this pen, right? You have the ability to pick this pen out from the background of the rest of the image, right? Um, some of the properties of figure and ground that the Gestaltists discovered, the figure is more like a particular thing that we know and understand, right? So it's going to be something that we are used to perceiving, something that we know is a proper thing, right? An object. And it's going to be distinct from the forgettable background, right? The figure is always seen in front of the background, or in front of the ground, right? So ground is always in the back, and the figure is always perceived as being a little bit closer to you than the ground, right? The ground is always uniform. The ground is always kind of vague and uniform, whereas the figure is much more detailed. And the ground always runs behind the figure, right? And then the shape that's helping you to tell the border between the figure and the background belongs to the figure. In other words, there's not anything in the background that's projecting a shape onto the figure. The shape of the figure and the borders of the figure that you perceive are properties of the figure itself, not the background. Okay, and if you know anything about art, one of the things that artists do is they mess around with this stuff, right? They play with figure and background and try to trick you and do all kinds of artistic things, right? So here's the classic example of figure ground, right? So if we perceive the middle light colored part as the figure, and the rest is the background, we see like this a vase, right? If, however, we perceive these two, the blue parts, the dark blue parts, as the figure and the light part as the background, we instead see two women kind of looking at each other like they're about to kiss or something, right? And here it is taken out, right? So you can see it a little bit easier, the vase and the two kissing women. Um, Factors that determine which area is the figure, right? So when we immediately look at something, one of the many things that our perceptual apparatus do is to try to separate out what's the figure and what's the ground, right? Um, Typically, just because of the way the world is laid out, where you have the sky and the background, typically the elements of the figure are in the lower part of the display, right? Or in the lower part of the display. Also, the the figure is located. It's defined by convex borders as opposed to concave borders. It's defined by convex borders, right? So, for example, if we look here, right? If we look at the red part, right? In this image here, this is kind of a random image, right? This is kind of a random image. We see that the red part here is perceived as the figure. So, just like I said, just because of the way the world is arranged, typically we see the background, sky, and everything, and then whatever we're looking at is kind of right down there in front of us. So this is perceived as the figure. And also notice that we have the shape as well. This is the exact same image but flipped on its side. and it's about 50-50 which one people perceive as the figure. Is this one the figure or is this one the figure, right? So it's not really a property of the color. It's the property of how the color appears relative to the background, and we perceive figures as being sort of in the lower chunk of our visual field, right? Here's an example, right? This is an example of a scene, right? And the background of this scene is going to be the sky and these distant trees, right? Which are predominantly at the top part of the image. And then whenever we're looking at something like this, the stuff that we're interested in is going to be typically located toward the bottom part of the image, right? So the farmhouse, the lake, the road, right? It's all in the lower part, whereas the background stuff is going to be in the top, right? Um, the Gestalt psychologists really believed that these perceptual mechanisms were innate. Okay, innate. In other words, they were pre-wired into. I don't want to use the term pre-wired too strongly. They were just simply a part or a property of our minds, of our consciousness, right? That it was just something that we did, right? They really didn't think that experience or meaning had much role in perceptual organization. They believe that these perceptual abilities that we have of grouping and connectedness was just an innate function of our minds. That's a very German thing to believe, right? That's very much what Kant believed and about how the mind works. And so, it's a very German thing to believe, right? That's how it works. However, the very famous ecological perceptual scientist Gibson showed that our perception of figure ground can be modified and changed by meaning, right? By the types of meaning that we attach to something.